Scott and Helle strategizing how to really provoke and enthuse you this evening. I hope you're going to have time to join us and more specifically come up with questions, with comments, in fact, with the topics that you think we will be discussing. We will leave no stone left unturned when it comes to discussing this very, very important issue of sustainability as a strategy and where ESG stands today. So stay tuned and please tune in at about 10 minutes from now at 6:30 when we go live with Scott and Helle. See you very soon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening. Not long ago, ESG, sustainability, were celebrated as the future of business. It used to shape board agendas, investment flows, even corporate communications. You are not going to forget that every major company had a net zero target or a pledge. Sustainability teams were expanding, C suite roles were invented, and of course, the language of purpose and long term value creation was the mainstream. And yet, here we are today. Today, literally, ESG is under siege. Political backlash has made the term radioactive, what I always say is the Voldemort of corporate terminology, the term that shall not be named. Regulatory clarity is wavering. Do you see the EU thinking an omnibus about simplification? Investor sentiment is more divided than ever. Some firms are pulling back entirely, others are trying to rebrand, others are green hashing, and some of them are just going entirely quiet. But let's be clear, this moment is not just a communications crisis, it's a reckoning. And it's revealing something deeper about how companies set their priorities, about how boards govern under pressure, about how markets reward and what they reward, or in fact, punish, especially when it comes to long term thinking. This session, though, is not about defending ESG as a label. In fact, I feel that we're way past that conversation. And on the other hand, it's not about throwing our hands up in frustration. It's about asking the harder, the better, but also the deeper questions that we should be asking right now. So, what does it take to lead on sustainability when the political winds are strongly turning against you? What is it that distinguishes firms that retreat from those that actually hold their ground steady or, in fact, double down? And how do we move beyond ESG as a branding exercise and, looking a bit more forward, start treating it as a lens for strategic foresight and resilience? This evening, I'm not going to be the only one asking questions. In fact, you can ask questions as well. Please do add your questions in the comments below. And me, my avatar, and my media persona, all of which you can see online at the same time, will be incorporating them as we go along in this evening's discussion. We're also going to be highlighting a selection of comments on screen. But enough for me. I am absolutely and beyond thrilled to welcome to this online event two exceptional thinkers, practitioners, friends, fellow travelers on this sustainability, ESG, and governance trip. First, Helle Bank Jorgensen, who is a global authority on corporate governance and boardroom leadership. Helle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And congrats on the 60 years.
Thank you. And Scott Newton, whose work with Fortune 1000 companies has reshaped how strategy and transformation are executed under real world constraints. Scott, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here.
To be very clear, this evening, we would like to create a space to have honest, bold conversation and quite literally and genuinely think about and think aloud what comes next in this space. So let's get started. I'm going to start with my first rather broad question. If sustainability was meant to be a driver of long-term value, why is it that so many companies are stepping back precisely when the stakes seem to be highest? What exactly has broken down so that we know perhaps what we need to fix going forward? Hel, would you like to help us with that question?
Sure. Happy to take the first crack on it. I think you can look at that from three different angles. One would be lack of insight, lack of foresight. And frankly, if that's the case, that the leadership, the board of directors haven't had the discussion around the boardroom table about what really drives value for our company, and therefore say, well, you know what, that didn't work. let's cut that. I totally agree that would be a waste of shareholder money and they should stop it. Then I think you have a group that perhaps have a little bit of fear at the moment. They see that this is something that's, been valuable, but why, be the highest tree in the forest? And greenwashing, whatever we should call it, happening while the work is still going on. And then I think you have the third category where you have leaders, board directors, boardrooms that have discussed why is this so important for the business, why it's so important to drive value.
Mhm.
And they continue and are out there speaking about it, or perhaps are greenwashing because they can see that they might get a competitive advantage by now continuing the work without telling everyone about it. And there are pros and cons for these, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, that's a very clarifying classification, I think, in terms of what's happening on boards. And I promised our listeners tonight that I was going to also be a bit more provocative. So let me just pose this direct question to you, then, Kjell, and then I'll bring in Scott as well. Is this ultimately then a governance failure? Have we confused ESG literacy with ESG conviction in boardrooms?
I don't know if this is a governance failure. Yes, it's a failure that we don't have the insight, the foresight around boardroom tables all over the world. But let's also be frank. We're celebrating 60 years, right? 60 years ago, no one was talking about this. When I started 30 years ago, people were saying, why should we care about environmental issues, until we started realizing, well, we could build higher, smokestacks, we could longer pipelines. But at the end of the day, it came back to us again, the pollution, the dead fish in the sea, etc. And that's why we started looking at it. The Brundtland report, back in 1987, if I recall, where we had Brundtland in terms of sustainable development. So I don't think it's a failure. I think it's simply that we don't have enough people around those boardroom tables and in executive suite who really have the knowledge, who have the understanding, who have the insight, the foresight to see how important this is for the future value creation, and also how important it is in terms of not losing money today, getting the innovation tomorrow. There's a lot of cost savings that companies haven't seen, because are we measuring those cost savings? No, not really. So I think this is about knowledge. This is about insight. This is about capacity building. This is about upskilling. Call it what you want. But that's where we need to start. And that's, I guess, what you're doing, what I'm doing, what we all are doing. So
great, thank you. Thank you. And Scott, I want to ask you a similar question. In other words, is this a governance failure? And let me just add a bit and build on what Hel was just saying. So is it the case that the ESG that we built from the ground up and over the years, is it the case that ESG was always just too easy to co-opt? Was the language, in other words, of ESG and the frameworks and all these things that we built around it, was it too technocratic, too abstract? Was it too fragile, ultimately, to withstand the political and cultural pushback that we're currently experiencing?
That's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of people took ESG and made their own inputs to it. And what I mean by that is that there was not always a clear definition of, what is ESG? What are we doing with it? And so a lot of political causes and I believe this got brought in. And of course, that made it more fragile because that made it more open to attack. So when I look at ESG, I think of it as a risk framework. It's a transparency in decision making, nothing less, nothing more. It can be a very good tool in governance, but it is not by itself a governance tool. And so what happened in some organizations as well is you had a marketing office or a communications office, and they said, this is a great initiative, we can communicate it. Where the reality is, this needs to be a decision that starts with the board, that aligns with the investors, and that managers really sign up on as, now we're going to take this and do something important and impactful, not get a sticker so that we can sell more coffee or whatever it is.
Yeah. And I think if I were to add to both of your thoughts, I also think, I like to think in silver linings, right? And ultimately, if there was no ESG pushback at all, I would be very concerned, right? Because that means we're not having an impact on anything. We are not upsetting sort of vested interests, or we're not as upsetting the status quo that ultimately we may need to upset or change in order to potentially build a more sustainable, a more low carbon, a more responsible, and a more inclusive economy. I would be concerned, in other words, if folks were entirely ignoring ESG and not attacking it. But ultimately, in many ways, this pushback, it is a little bit of a moment of clarity, right? And because it kind of reveals who are those that perhaps did not have the fickle commitments and quickly, because of political expediency, are willing to capitulate or compromise, depending on the pressure that they're facing, as opposed to those who are, as a matter of principle and ultimately as a matter of integrity, maintain their commitment. Because lest we forget that we might have a pushback, might even have geopolitical risk, but ultimately, if we really think about long term, as we claim to be thinking, well, at some point, we'll have to look back at this period. At some point, we'll have to look back and say, well, when it was not politically convenient, what did you do as a business? And ultimately, what did you do as a leader during this time? I do wonder, though, because we have now the regulatory developments in the EU. We have an emerging trade war. We have fragmentation in terms of reporting, in terms of initiatives. Some regions of the world are following a more pragmatic approach, other a more political, contested approach to ESG, and so on. But if we were to take a step back and have sort of a bird's eye view to this confusion, effectively, does anyone benefit from this confusion as companies rebrand sustainability under different names or try to sort of decouple climate action or decarbonization from ESG to different things, right? Is this a phase of sort of performative pragmatism? Is that more dangerous than complete and open disengagement? What do you think about this? Who is benefiting from this confusion? And are we, is this pragmatism kind of a fig leaf that companies may be adopting?
Scott, do you want to go first, or should I?
You go ahead, and then I'll jump in afterwards.
All right. So, who benefits? I think those who benefits are probably the ones that have said, oh, let's wait and see what we should do on these areas. Those, again, I'm going back to those who have not had the discussion around the boardroom table, those who have not really seen what are the risks, what are the opportunities. And Scott, you mentioned as a risk framework. I would say it's both a risk framework and an opportunity framework. And I couldn't care less what we call it. I remember the time where we had CSR, corporate social responsibility. Before then, we called it something else, et cetera, shared value. This is about common business sense. This is about looking at your risks, looking at your opportunities, and then embed that integrate it into both the business functions, but also the value chain. And I think everyone at the moment are talking about supply chain. Everyone at the moment are talking about how do we ensure that we are prepared in terms of AI or other matters. This is not different. So those that benefit, if you call it like that, you could say those are the ones that haven't really kept up and been ready to go with all the regulation. But I'm not sure if they're really benefiting. Because this is about having the insight, having the foresight. I'm an accountant by training. If you run a company without having any financial numbers, would you feel safe of having people in the audit committee that don't understand what is it the financials are saying? No, of course we would not. And nowadays, there's a lot more that's not on the balance sheet. There's a lot more that really can hurt the company, or the company can benefit from innovation. So I think the short run, you would say, oh, those that benefit, those that are, were behind all their competitors. But in reality, it's probably not benefiting. It's dragging out the pain a little bit.
Scott, what are your views on this?
Yeah, dragging out the pain, I think, is a very good way to put it. Thank you, Helen, for that. Look, I mean, there's obviously the political actors that benefit from leveraging a culture war. But leaving those aside, if we look in the business world, there can be some short-term benefit. However, I would emphasize the risk of long-term stranded assets. And I think many organizations that are doubling down on coal energy or only petrocarbons could be in a position in a few years where they've made some large capex investments and they will not have a way out of them, or they'll have a really disappointing result. So at the moment, pushing back on environmental regulation may give you a little bit of breathing room, but not globally. And one quick example of that, let's look what's going on in mobility. So China, of course, went all in on the electric vehicle, and by some estimates, they are 5, 6, 7 years ahead in the electric vehicle at the moment. Now, a combination of regulation and customer pushback in some markets will give a little bit of breathing room to the OEMs in Europe and the Americas. But if they do not take that and run with it, it won't be that long till we remember, like we have the Studebaker Museum in Indiana, which was something really nice, and now is a small museum with a big empty lot. So that's what I would say that the warning is. Yes, you might have some short-term benefit, but I don't think long-term that will help any of your stakeholders in being sustainable as a business.
Great, thank you both. I think that this idea of confusion reminds me, rather alarmingly, reminds me sometimes the strategy of the oil and gas industry, which is instead of climate change denial, we go with delay, delay, delay. And therefore, I wonder if history tends to repeat itself, right? Because we've seen this in the past when the tobacco industry wanted to undermine the research on lung cancer, when the oil and gas industry itself although having shown the link since the 1970s, right, between CO2 emissions and climate change, or even before that, they still had a strategy of spreading doubt. And again, doubt, confusion is a delay tactic. So I do wonder if, to some extent, by the way, this is of course not to say that there's nothing wrong with ESG. Far from it. There's many things that we ought to fix, and we will be fixing them. But the question is whether there is an element of that sort of thing going on in the background. I'll leave that as an open question for now. History will tell us at some point, I do think. But I do want to bring in some questions from the audience, and just a reminder to everybody watching that you can share your questions with me by posting them in the comments below. We're monitoring that as well, and we'll bring them in and discuss them with our guests. So one is that's interesting. We all talked about governance, but one of our audience members says, is it governance or is it leadership intention that is the issue? And I wonder if this listener is kind of indirectly putting on the table the idea that they, at least for some folks, the intentions maybe were never genuine, and therefore the backlash feels like a retreat. What are your views on that? If you were to reflect on, the many leaders that you're speaking to, is it an intention problem or is it a governance problem?
Hey, Scott, is it me again?
I'll let you go first and I'll join in, please.
I think it's a mindset. And I'm going back to, if you don't have the understanding of the risks and the opportunities, well, then it's more, do I really understand? Am I able to make informed decisions? It's hard to make informed decisions if you're not informed. If this is an intention saying, oh, you know what, I'll go with that. I'll put some pictures into our annual report that shows the right things, and then done with that tick box exercise. Yeah, then you have missed the boat. You have not seen the real value. You have, and again, I'm saying you have misused shareholder money, right? You have wasted money because you haven't really understood how do you drive the value out of the activities that you have started. And so if it's an intentional, oh, I'll just do it for marketing, but I don't really expect any real value. Well, then you are losing value. You have been losing value all the time, and you're not prepared for actually getting the value out of your investment. That is a bad investment. You don't get the return on your investment. I mean, why do it in the first place then?
Great, thanks. Help, Scott.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of points. I think that the role of the board needs to be to really align with investors and have also investors understand that investments in sustainability, in long-term decisions, do not have an instant payback. And I think some of this confusion started with communication that sustainability would be a free activity somehow, or doesn't require heavy investments. And certainly, I mean, this is a transformation of the logic of how companies create value. That requires big investments, and they're not going to pay back in 180 days. So this is, again, where the board needs to give management some air cover, so to speak, and also with investors to say, look, are you really committed to this? Because we cannot say that, just because you're investing in sustainability, you're going to have higher returns. As many of your colleagues in the economics department have demonstrated, that's not necessarily the case. But it doesn't necessarily need to be the case in terms of, if we want to make a company that's going to be ready for the next 60 years, then we have to invest in that. And just as we don't have people delivering ice anymore, house to house, we won't necessarily have people burning petrocarbons anymore to generate energy, which is totally fine. But I think that's where the issue is when we talk about intention, we talk about governance, what's your time frame? Because as you shift that, decisions become quite different.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to link that to the next segment and a couple of questions that have come in. But let me just add by saying this. I agree with everything that you both said, but I also feel that sometimes in the sustainability space, there is these double standards. And you're just talking about, Scott, in terms of especially the payout horizon of these investments, right? But I wonder why that criterion suddenly becomes the beginning and end of all discussions when it comes to sustainability. Because, I mean, I've never heard someone say, oh my God, paying wages is such a big cost. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it. Or someone say, what is the trade-off between paying wages and being profitable? I mean, what's the other way of running a business, right? I mean, of course, you're going to define the level of wages so that you balance things out and ultimately have a profitable business. That's why we call it an investment, right? But otherwise, in an investment decision making. But it seems that for sustainability, it's almost more and more existential thing. If we should even have an investment, but we never ask, rightfully so, if we should ever pay wages in order to have a business. So that's why I wonder, why is it that we don't switch to that mind frame that actually sees sustainability so core that it's not a question of whether, but actually a question of of the level effectively. And what I would add to that, by the way, is that a lot of the times the other double standard that we use in sustainability is about trade-offs, right? Which relates to what we're just discussing. And as I often tell my students, by the way, is as follows: if there were no trade-offs in business, we would all be out of a job. Like, if it was everything win-win, why do you need an MBA for? Why do you need any business degree? You're a win-win. You cannot go wrong, right? Managerial discretion and capability comes in precisely when we have trade-offs. We don't ignore or resolve trade-offs. The whole idea is thriving within them. Don't take it from me. Again, as I often say to my students, Michael Porter, the father of strategy, told us strategy is all about trade-offs. He didn't say hide them, ignore them, or eliminate them. He basically taught us build a business around them. So why don't we bring those powerful ideas? And by the way, I talked a bit longer, but actually I just answered a question for someone in the audience who said, what role do academic institutions play in defining the opportunities for investment in ESG and providing a vehicle to deliver measurable impact? That's your answer. I think what I believe is our job is to change that mind frame in precisely the way that I described to you, in actually seeing the core function of sustainability and changing these false myths about this, double standards. Which brings me, of course, to the next question I wanted to turn to both of you, right? We talked a lot about what might have gone wrong and detected that in multiple ways, but, time to gaze towards the future, right? And more specifically, who will lead now? In many conversations I have with executives, they don't just tell me, how do we do this, meaning integrating sustainability and ESG, but rather, how do I do and I survive doing this, right? How do I integrate and survive doing this? So, what are your views from your experience, especially in strategy execution more broadly? What would you advise executives? What does leadership look like when sustainability and ESG becomes so politically risky as it is now?
So, I mean, the first thing I'd say about that is I don't think it needs to be risky. Uh, Clearly, there are, in the United States, some viewpoints right now that might be temporarily sensitive. But at the end of the day, a business cannot be sustainable if it's creating waste that and these externalities. Sooner or later, it will get legislated out of business. I saw the CEO of Philip Morris was speaking today in Italy, and he said, "You know what? I think Italy will be the first smokeless country in Europe." And he predicted that would come in 10 years or less. Which, if you go back 10 years, that was unfathomable. I mean, everyone in Italy was smoking on the train, and now here we are saying it's going to be a smokeless country, which leads me to say, look, you need to engage with your stakeholders and take decisions that are going to be responsible for your future. Part of sustainability is you have to have a profit, or you will not be able to continue as a business. Part of it, though, is you must be socially acceptable to your community and your stakeholders, or you will also not have a business. So it's balancing these effects out. And when do you know it's working? When you're taking responsible decisions, and everybody can be proud about them. Your customers, your investors, your shareholders, and you can explain the why. So why am I doing this? And it doesn't have to be just so I can have the highest net income this quarter, but it does have to be so that my business is going to give an acceptable return to my investors for the next 10, 20, 50 years. And we know most companies don't even last 15 years anymore. So right away, we have an issue.
Yeah. Cal, I would love to hear your views on this. If I could also add another layer, given you observe boards up close and very often, and I do wonder though, often companies do not speak with one voice. Clearly, there's a lot of internal dynamics that happen, right? Some functions may be more or less prone to adopt, embrace, integrate sustainability. So in a context in which, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, in a context in which political uncertainty may have amplified those internal conflicts across divisions, across departments, across functions. What is the board supposed to do while running the business, advising the executives, while at the same time trying to keep an eye on the political situation and the sort of the changing climate outside the business?
Sure. And well, let's start. It's not the board running the business. I hope it's the CEO, management team, and the good people within the company. But clearly, this has been becoming hard for the board as well, because you have different opinions in different parts of the world. In some parts of the world, there's something that's illegal, while it is a compliance requirement in other parts of the world. How do you deal with that as a multinational? How do you have those conversations, both at the boardroom table, at the headquarter level, but what about at the local level? So we just ran a competent boards. This where we have this global forum, and it's like, is it global localization or is it local globalization? Right? How do you bring, as a company, your values, what you stand for, the purpose of that business around the world, but at the same time respect local values, local cultures, etc. So it's not easy to be a board member nowadays. Going back to, that's why you need to have that insight and the foresight. And then I have to let you know, when you say, well, of course we're not questioning if we should have employees or not. Well, there are companies that are now saying, start by looking into AI agents before you can say, I would like to hire a new employee. So we are starting to look at different ways from leadership to, manage the business. I totally agree with Scott. Having pollution as a strategy is not a strategy, because that will come and bite you. If it doesn't come and bite you from, legislatures, the insurance company will come and bite you, right? Will insurance company actually keep doing the insurance? Will the premium goes up? Well, if you have those stranded assets, what are you going to do with those in the future? The future will also come and bite you in terms of who will buy your products, who will work for you. When you look at the banks that are starting to see we are going to live in a 3-degree world, what does that mean for how much credit they're going to give you? What are the questions that they will ask? So there's a lot about leadership. And I believe that board directors, they have the obligation, they have the responsibility when they join a board to say, how do I ensure that this company is better when I leave the board than when I joined? And to do that, you also must say, how do I ensure that my stakeholders, the community we're part of, do better? Because otherwise, frankly, you're not going to be a successful company. So I think it is a lot of, and then if I may, the future boardroom, how to transform in turbulent times. My new book that just came yesterday, I'll show it here. Clearly have a lot of insight from a lot of leaders around the world on how they deal with politics, how they deal with geopolitical issues, how they deal with ESG, DEI, backlash, how they deal with AI, and much more in that sense. Going back to the same, I'm sounding like a broken record. If you don't have the insight, if you don't have the foresight, if you don't have the curiosity to ask the questions, if you don't have the minds around that boardroom table that will question what is really relevant from this business, not the checklist. Don't go in and say, oh, have we done this? Tick mark, tick mark, tick mark. That is not really bringing value. Mm-hmm. It is having those smart people around that boardroom table in the leadership that are asking questions, that are curious, but also have the compassion for understanding how will people look at us in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years? What are my children saying when they come back from school and they say in school that, what you do is taking away my future. Is that correct, Mom? You don't want to have that, or granddad, or whoever it is. So just look around corners. Understand what are the expectations. That's leadership.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Helen. And Scott, if I can add to what Helen was just saying, now that we got to the people on the board, right? Well, ultimately, isn't it the shareholders that have the core responsibility to hold those board members responsible, to vote sometimes on key initiatives? So if we were to also extend the question of who appoints the board effectively, right? So what do you think, Scott, is the responsibility of the shareholders then into that sort of pathway that Hel was just describing to us in terms of how the board can then advise, monitor the executive? What is the role and responsibility of shareholders?
I mean, shareholders have an enormous responsibility because they vote on the major issues, and they should not be abstaining from exercising that responsibility. In addition, if they're really unhappy with the organization, they also can sell their shares. And I mean, I encourage voting, of course, first, but if you're not able to get some change, then selling the shares is also a major driver, because any organization that sees their valuation declining is going to do something to stop this. So I think we have two things here where we really need to emphasize responsibility and action. And the first one is be sure to vote, and be sure to vote informed on the issues. And the second one is invest in the organizations that you believe in and that are following what you think the future should look like. Because ultimately, those two decisions will drive any organization and will make change happen.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Scott. So let's have another look within the organization. And there's some of the questions are coming from the audience, and please do keep them coming. I'm reading them. I might not be phrasing the questions exactly as you pose them because there's so many of them, but I try to do this multitasking of reading a couple of questions and combining them into one. So let's look at internal stakeholders then. We talked about shareholders, we talked about board, but what if we were to talk about integrating sustainability and ESG with respect to the employees? And by the way, a lot of the times we look at this category of employees or stakeholders, of course, forgetting that companies have multiple employees in multiple locations, in multiple roles. So we cannot just use a blanket statement of employees and have, and cover, if you like, all the initiatives that one may decide to adopt in order to truly integrate sustainability. So in both of your views, then, if we were to come out of the boardroom, so to speak, and look at in this current climate and the role of leadership in actually conveying this message convincingly, genuinely, right? What have you seen as best practice? And I'm asking this because I don't want to name particular companies at this point in time, but we have seen companies where 2-3 years ago they were telling their employees, you know what, diversity, inclusion, and so on are, foundational principles of our company. And 2 years afterwards, they quite literally wipe out those terms. So if you're an employee, what sort of trust can you have in an organization who changes its foundational principles according to how the wind blows? In other words, what are your views and your tips and advice at the intersection of leadership and internal stakeholders, especially employees and several different categories of employees within organizations?
So the first thing I'd say is that the younger generation is looking at this with a much different frame than some of the more senior generations. And when I talk to leaders in large organizations, they feel a lot of pressure from their younger and newer employees that, what are you doing? And you have this written in your value statement. Now, show me the behaviors that actually reflect on this. So I think what employees do is they look at what you've written in your values and your beliefs, and they check it against the behaviors of the organization. And if they see there's a conflict there, they will start looking for a new company, a new job. And as I remind senior leaders, I mean, we have a demographic problem in all the major economies in the world right now. The population is contracting rapidly. So the competition for high potential talent continues to grow. And if you are not able to attract that high potential talent, what is the future of your organization? How will you even be able to survive? And so I think this is where management has a responsibility to model the behaviors they've stated they have and know that your employees are watching you and your employees will follow you. But if they see a disconnect, they're also going to start looking for their next opportunity. And you really cannot afford that as an organization today. The fight is for talent. And this is only going to get more and more intense in the upcoming 2 decades.
Kel, what are your views on that?
Yeah, I'll agree with you, Scott. And I think, we have this cash is king, right? And you will have a lot of also people that employed say, well, I need the job right now, and this is paying well. But I think while cash is king, care is queen. And if we don't care for our employees, if we don't care for it, the same goes with our suppliers, the same goes with all the other stakeholders. Well, why should they care for us? Right? And you might hold that, relationship. It's a transactional relationship. Then I'll pay you money. You come and do whatever work. But as Scott is saying, the chance you get to then do something that's more meaningful, that is also paid. You'll probably jump to do that. And you're seeing there's a lot of younger people that's also and older that are involved in a lot of different not-for-profit organizations that want to do something, right? We can call it social responsibility, we can call it what we want, but that's kind of like that really caring for the society. And I think if we don't have companies that care for those that many call their most important asset, if you read a lot of annual report, it will say, our employees are our most, material important asset. Let's say maybe in the future it will be our AI agents are our most, but let's keep that away from now. You need to invest. I can make a fantastic bottom line result if I say I'm not going to train anyone. The question is, for how long can I do that? I can say I can make my P&L in my income statement can look much better if I don't do any, innovation. But for how long?
Mm-hmm. Great.
So this is about, investing. In both today and also the future. And I think, going back to Scott in terms of the investors, I mean, most of the investors are pension plans that are holding their investment for a long time and are hopefully going to hold them in a way that means that we will have our retirement funds at some point. And if they only invest in a very short time horizon, we might not have that retirement that we want. So I think that's another part that's, yes, you have a lot of going forth and back in the market. We can just look at the stock market the last couple of days, right? But how do you ensure that we have the funding in a world that we want to live in? Because if the world is on fire, there's floods and droughts and everything else, right? Well, then we might not need that all of those pension or retirement funds. But let's hope that that's not going to be the case.
Right. So both of you, of course, referred a lot to the strategic aspect, to the institutional aspect of ESG and sustainability, but both of you also mentioned very strongly, if I may say so, the deeply human aspect of these environmental and social challenges that we face, and how that perhaps feeds into leadership styles and how we engage employees and how ultimately we express our leadership in organizations. And I do wonder if looking forward, if a fundamental reframing of what ESG is for is what we're missing, or if it's the answer in terms of where do we go from here. And I'll share with you a provocative thesis, and I'm very interested to hear what you think. It's something that's been on my mind for some time now. I feel that if I were to reflect back on what one may call the ESG movement, I do feel that to some extent, taking a bit of an extreme view, it became a bit of an elitist project. In other words, we talked with regulators, we talked with corporate elites, and we talked with investors, the financial elites, if you like. But perhaps there's a huge chunk of folks that we did not sufficiently engage, whether is the labor unions, the communities, the small and medium-sized enterprises, the consumer, ultimately at the level where it matters, at the level where sustainability and ESG may have improved his or her life. In other words, the narrative seems to me to have been hijacked as a narrative of identity, as a narrative of national security, as a narrative of the other, as opposed to a narrative which is about innovation. It is ultimately about growth, but healthy growth in a world where we can all live healthier, more sustainable lives in a planet that can actually sustain us. That narrative even has been part of the elitist conversations. But I personally feel, and please do correct me if you think otherwise, I would love to hear what you think, that this narrative was not the narrative of ESG or sustainability for that matter. And therefore, we left those stakeholders behind, and that power vacuum was exploited from someone else. So perhaps as a more forward-looking and question, is there a role for reframing sustainability and ESG, you choose your term, as a bigger project, as a political economy project, as opposed to an elitist niche project, as the answer to the backlash and moving what actually matters, right? Sustainability forward. What would be your reactions to that framing?
I mean, my one-word answer is yes. Yes, there is. Look, there was too much emphasis on regulation and reporting as opposed to necessarily action. One of the companies I'm on the board of, the CEO, she likes to remind me regularly. She says, Scott, reporting is not sustainability. So we've missed that inclusion of the community and the inclusion of all the stakeholders to say, like, what we're doing now isn't working. We've also left a lot of people out from this economy currently. And so it's logical that they have a backlash to what's going on. So how do we bring everyone on board and start making more responsible decisions, and decisions that include our communities and our society, as opposed to saying, how do a few people profit from this? Because it's not just about profit. I mean, obviously organizations must be profitable to survive, but there are other elements of the decision. And I think that as we reframe this and become more inclusive, then it becomes an opportunity for everyone to get on board with the change, as opposed to, oh, look, the government's just given us another regulation and it's going to cost you, taxpayer, 20,000 euros or dollars a year, and you don't have it. And so this is where we need to move and move away from dictation and more towards, here's a problem, how do we all solve it? And of course, regulation is part of this, compliance is part of this, but it's also involvement and activation at multiple levels.
Thank you, Scott. Elle, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does. I do think, again, I think, God, you said it at some point, this ESG was meant as a framework, not for the ordinary, I was going to say, the people on the street to go in and say, oh, we want some ESG, right? No, this was a framework to be used, financial institutions and companies to just, it's easier to say, okay, what are our environmental risk? What's our social risk? What's our governance risk? And I'll add in opportunities as well. And then categorize that way. I started over 30 years ago doing the first green account in the world. That was not because there was any regulation. The regulation came later on. That was because the people in the neighborhood started saying, oh, there's smoke in the air. There are fish that doesn't look like they're having as good a time. This have an impact on us as society. We had the longer smokestacks, we had the longer pipelines. And even though it seems to come back to us, I don't think there's any people on wherever you go in the world that wouldn't like to have clean air, that wouldn't like to have clean water, that wouldn't like to have good food to give to their children, that wouldn't like to have a society where they felt that they could be safe. I mean, I traveled most of the world. I haven't found one single person that says, oh, I don't want to have clean water. It's the connection between what are we doing today and then what impact will that have in the future. Mm-hmm. There's the 7 generation principles with an indigenous principle. Whatever action you make today, what impact will that have 7 generations from now? I think we lost as leaders, we lost as human beings to think about what's the impact of what we're doing. It's so convenient what we do now. And blame us all, right? Because we're all doing what's convenient. But thinking about it, and I'm going back to, if you're not informed, how can you make informed decisions? Mm-hmm. Hence, while we need to have, and yes, I'm working with board of directors all over the world, so I keep saying board of directors and executives, but it goes, all of these fantastic young people that you have in the school, the MBA students, it goes with everyone. What are we talking about around the kitchen table? Mm-hmm. Right? And I think most human beings, as I said, want to have clean air and clean water. And I was just finding, in terms of the book, Martin Wolf from Financial Times who contributed, and he said, I don't expect business people to be saints, but they also have to be very cognizant of where the limits are. And then he says they should always ask themselves, at the very least, how would you feel if this becomes a front page investigation by the FT on some other newspaper, right? And I think that's been something that we have had for a long time. I remember working with a lot of companies, and there was like this reputation. We might at the moment see, do you hurt your reputation with doing, or do you hurt your reputation by not doing? But again, look out 10 years from now. There was a time where corruption was just, yeah, that's normal business.
Mm-hmm.
I was asked a question when I've had my exam as state authorized public accountant: how much can you deduct in bribe?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Hele. I'm very sorry to say, although I'm also glad to say, that when speaking with you both, time is absolutely vicious, and we are 4 minutes before time. So what I would like to do next is ask you a quick question, 1 minute each to answer, and then I'll use the last 2 minutes to bring this session to a close. So my rapid fire question is as follows. I'm not going to ask you if you're optimistic or pessimistic. I know both of you, and I know that you are optimistic. So what keeps you optimistic, and why should all of us be optimistic? What would be your quick 1 minute response to that question? Scott, would you like to? Yeah.
Yeah. Every day I meet some great startups and they're working on new problems. And actually, just last week, I was on campus at LBS with the Launchpad, and there were 16 companies, all with new ideas. 14 of them were focused on sustainability. And so this is going on all over the world, not just in London. And there are new entrepreneurs, new investors that are saying, how are we going to solve these tough problems? And it's not acceptable to continue with business as usual. And those organizations are going to disrupt the companies that don't embrace this. So I'm optimistic because there's new ideas, there's new capital, and there are new frameworks that are moving forward. And it's just a matter of, are you going to get on board, or are you going to be in the history book?
Terrific. Thank you, Scott. Hal, what do you think?
Very quickly, I am optimistic because we are actually getting questions from those hiring new boards, asking. They see that leaders have the competent boards certificate, etc., and want to know more about that. Want to know if that is kind of like a certification that they can trust that those board members have the insight and have the foresight. So the fact that we are starting to see recruiters, the fact that we're starting to see board members, wanted to get upskilled, capacity building, training, whatever we want to call it, tells me that you have a lot of people in that future boardroom that will take on the task and make sure that they have their reputation that they want, both today and in the future.
Great, thank you. So, ladies and gents, what we have heard today, I hope in your minds as well, confirms what many of us already suspected. This is not just a temporary backlash. It is, if I were to frame it, a stress test, a moment that is actually exposing whether companies built their sustainability commitments on solid ground or whether those commitments were conditional on tailwinds. But we have also heard through our discussion today that this moment, as difficult as it is, can be a clarifying moment. It's clarifying who is leading and who is waiting, who is integrating sustainability into strategy and who is treating it or was treating it as a checkbox, who understands ESG as a long-term foresight and who sees it as a short-term liability. And yet, we shouldn't pretend that the answers are easy. These are complex times. Leadership in this space does come with real cost right now, whether they're political or reputational or even personal. But lest we forget that the important question, the deeper question, isn't just whether ESG survives as a framework, it's whether the underlying work, the climate risk, the supply chain resilience, the human capital, the innovation, whether that real underlying work continues even when the spotlight ultimately moves on. So as you leave this conversation this evening, I invite you to sit and reflect on difficult questions. When sustainability is no longer fashionable, what story will your company choose to tell? What trade-offs are you personally willing to make, not in theory, right now, in your next board meeting, in your next capital allocation decision, in your next earnings call? And perhaps most importantly, when the pressure to perform persists, but the attention to sustainability itself fades, will you and your business and your organization hold the line? Scott, Kel, it's been an absolute honor and a privilege. Hal, congratulations on the publication of your new book. Thank you to both for taking the time to join us, answer the provocative questions that we posed this evening. And I sincerely look forward to continuing our conversations as these very important issues evolve. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.